I'm leaving, Noah.
I understand.
How much is he worth? 4 to 3.2 billion. I didn't know, Noah.
You never asked, Diana.
The morning Diana Whitmore walked out of the Wicker Park house with 2 hired movers and her mother's silence behind her, she felt nothing but certainty. She had taken the dining room table, the artwork she had chosen herself over 9 years, the kitchen appliances, and the last of what she believed was rightfully hers. What she did not take, what she had never thought to look for, was the 43 eyes. 2 billionaire sitting inside a network of holding companies, trusts, and Delaware subsidiaries, or every one of them bearing the name of her soon-to-be ex-husband, Noah Whitmore. That oversight would cost her everything she thought she had gained. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But to understand how that October morning came to pass, we need to go back to the woman Diana had become, and the man she had spent 9 years deciding she already knew. Diana Whitmore was 40 years old, the director of a respected art gallery on Michigan Avenue, and she moved through Chicago's cultural circles with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to be seen. She wore clothes that were chosen carefully and well. She attended the right dinners, sat on the right advisory boards, and could describe the provenance of a piece of mid-century furniture with the authority of someone who had grown up surrounded by beautiful things because she had. Her mother was Margaret Caldwell, and that was a sentence that explained a great deal on its own. Noah Whitmore, her husband of 9 years, was 42. He worked from a spare home office at the back of their house in Wicker Park, doing what he described, when anyone asked, as financial consulting. He drove a Volvo that was 11 years old. He wore clothes from ordinary stores. He cooked dinner most nights, kept the house immaculate, and smiled the same patient, unhurried smile every time Diana made her dissatisfaction known, which was often. She made it known at gallery openings, steering conversations smoothly away from what Noah did for a living. Whenever a colleague lingered on the question too long, she made it known at dinner parties, where she would reference other men's promotions and project wins in the tone of gentle observation that was not gentle at all. She made it known at home in the quiet, accumulated way that wears through things. The long look she gave his car every time he pulled it out of the driveway, the sigh when he declined a restaurant she had chosen, the habit of saying, before she had even finished her thought, that she wasn't asking for much. Noah said very little to any of it. He had long since stopped defending himself, not because he had no defense, but because the defense would require an explanation he was not ready to give. There was one morning, approximately 4 months before Diana filed the divorce papers, when she had been standing in the kitchen pouring coffee, and Noah had stepped into the hallway to take a call. She had heard him say in a voice she almost did not recognize, quiet, exact, carrying the particular weight of someone accustomed to being listened to, "Hold until I confirm. Tell Marcus at Northfield I'll have a position by end of week." Then nothing for 2 minutes. Then good, that's fine. He came back to the kitchen and poured himself coffee. "Who was that?" Diana asked. "Work," he said. She had looked at him for a moment, at his ordinary shirt, at his familiar, patient face, and then she had let it go. It was always work. It was always nothing worth following up on. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The decision to leave had not arrived suddenly. It had settled over the course of a year, the way a decision does when it has been approaching for much longer. By the time Diana retained Lydia Park, Chicago's most effective and most aggressive divorce attorney, she had already mapped the outcome in her mind with precision. She knew which accounts she would claim. She knew which assets Lydia would establish as hers. She knew the house would go to her because she had been the one who made it a home, or so she had always told herself. She had not asked whose name was on the deed. The morning the movers came, Noah was at the kitchen table with his laptop, as he almost always was. He looked up when Diana walked in with her mother and the 2 men behind her. He closed the laptop. He said nothing. "Don't make this difficult," Diana said, not looking at him, Her eyes were already moving over the room. Margaret Caldwell stood in the doorway in a coat that cost more than the refrigerator. She looked at Noah with the expression she had perfected over 9 years, not hostility exactly, but a kind of settled dismissal, as if the verdict had been reached long ago, and the only remaining question was how much longer everyone would have to endure the formalities. "You should count yourself lucky," she said. "A man in your position ought to be grateful she isn't asking for more." Noah looked at Margaret. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not the wounded defensiveness she was expecting. Something quieter, something that looked almost like a decision being made. Then he went back to his book. They took the dining table and the good chairs. They took the kitchen appliances Diana had selected, the artwork she had chosen from gallery shows over the years, the bedroom furniture, the curtains from the living room windows. They left the bare glass exposed to the October sky. Noah took only a worn leather notebook from his desk and a small carved wooden box that had belonged to his father. He carried both to his armchair in the stripped room and sat down. When the truck drove away, the house was hollow and cold. Noah sat in the bare room and looked at the pale rectangles on the walls where the pictures had been. He sat there for a while, then he picked up his phone. "Martin," he said when the call connected, "it's time." The story of how Diana Caldwell became Diana Whitmore is not a complicated one. But understanding it requires understanding the particular assumptions she had carried since childhood, about what mattered, about what constituted success, and about what a man was supposed to look like when he had it. She had grown up in the Caldwell house on the North Shore, in the world her mother had cultivated and maintained with the focused energy of a woman who understood that social position required constant, invisible work. Margaret Caldwell attended every gallery opening, sat on every cultural board that would have her, and conducted her relationships with the precision of someone keeping a ledger. Money in her world was not discussed openly. It was displayed quietly, referenced obliquely, and understood by everyone in the room without a word being said. Diana had inherited all of it, down to the bone. She had met Noah at a corporate finance conference downtown 9 years ago. She was 31, newly installed as an associate director at the gallery, full of the particular confidence that comes from being sharp and accomplished, and well-dressed in a room full of people who notice all three. Noah was standing near the windows with a glass of water, not wine, and something about his stillness had caught her attention. He was not performing. He was simply present, watching the room with an expression of mild, unhurried interest that she found, at the time, intriguing. He was charming when he spoke to her, not loudly, not with the performative ease she had grown accustomed to from men in those rooms, but directly, and with the focused attention of someone genuinely curious about what she thought. She had told herself that the ordinary suit and the quiet manner were markers of a man still on his way somewhere impressive. She had told herself that within 2 or 3 years, Noah Whitmore would look the way she expected. She had been wrong on every count, but that particular wrongness had taken 9 years to arrive fully, and it had arrived in pieces. The first piece came in their first year at a gallery dinner in the River North neighborhood. Diana introduced Noah to the Garfields, a couple she had been cultivating carefully, him a developer, her a museum trustee, and she said, without quite meaning to phrase it the way she did, "This is Noah, he does something in finance." She turned back to the Garfields before Noah could elaborate. She was managing the room. She had not thought about what she was also managing. The second piece came at Thanksgiving, in their 3rd year, at Margaret's house on the North Shore. The table was set with the good silver, the way it always was. Margaret waited until the soup course to ask, in her careful way, whether Noah's consulting work had really begun to take off. Noah said it was going well. He offered nothing further. Margaret smiled in the way she had, not warmly, but precisely, and turned her conversation toward her son-in-law at the other end of the table, who worked at a downtown law firm and whose trajectory she understood. The third piece came in their 5th year, at a party for her colleague Marcus's retirement. Diana was talking to Marcus's wife near the windows, and she heard herself say, before the woman had asked a single thing, "He's fine. He's just not ambitious in any real way." She had meant it as a kind of preemptive explanation. She had not considered that Noah was 12 feet behind her, refilling his glass. He never mentioned it. He had a gift for not mentioning things. The fourth piece, and this was the one that cost him the most, though he had never said so, came in their 7th year, at their own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Diana had been frustrated about something at the gallery, and the frustration had come out sideways, the way frustration often does in marriages. She had looked at him across the table and said, flatly, without apparent heat, "The honest truth is that the only reason I'm still here is that I can't afford to leave right now." Then she had reached for the wine and poured herself another glass. Noah had looked at her. He had said nothing. He had closed his laptop and walked to his home office, and when he came back 30 minutes later, he had sat down and eaten the dinner he had cooked earlier, and been, as he always was, perfectly civil. He had carried that sentence with him like something small and very heavy. What Noah had understood, somewhere in those 9 years, not in a single moment but in a slow, accumulating way that the mind does its honest work, was that Diana had never tried to know him. She had assessed him repeatedly and rigorously, against a set of criteria he had never met. But the knowing, the actual looking at who he was, what he was made of, what his work meant to him, what he cared about when the room was quiet, that had simply never happened. He had hoped for a long time that it might. He had told himself that patience was its own kind of argument, or that eventually the surface would stop mattering as much as what was underneath it. He had been profoundly, quietly wrong. The affair, when he realized it was happening, and he realized it with the same attentiveness he brought to everything, noticing the shift in her schedule, the new habits of a person rearranging their time around a secret, had not surprised him exactly. It had simply clarified something that had been approaching for a long time. The man she was seeing, a developer named Sebastian Rourke, was loud and visible and drove a car that announced itself. He was, by every visible metric, what Diana had always believed Noah should have become. Noah had watched and said nothing, and continued to work, and somewhere in the autumn of that last year, something in him had quietly, finally shifted, not into anger, but into the particular calm that arrives when a long wait is almost over. He kept a worn leather notebook in his desk drawer. He opened it occasionally, looked at the numbers, and the names he had written there over the years, the entity structure, the valuation figures, or the date he had circled in pen when he first considered that the time might be approaching. He looked at it that year more than he ever had before. Not yet he had thought each time, but soon. Sebastian Rourke had entered Diana's life through the gallery, the way most things entered Diana's life, through a professional context that made the personal feel inevitable. He had come to the opening of a photography exhibition, had stood in front of a large format piece for longer than most visitors did, and had then turned and asked Diana a question about the artist's earlier work that actually required her to think. She had been charmed before she meant to be. He was 46, broad-shouldered, and moved through rooms with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being the most visible person in them. He was a commercial developer with projects across the Midwest, mixed-use spaces, renovated industrial buildings converted to loft offices and retail, and he spoke about money the way men in his world spoke about weather, casually, as a matter of shared background, as though any other topic would be merely secondary. He drove a car that turned heads. He wore suits that announced themselves. He was, by every visible marker, what Diana had spent 9 years wishing Noah would become. The affair had been ongoing for 5 months when Diana retained Lydia Park. By that point, she was barely concealing it, the late arrivals, the phone set face down at dinner, the new perfume she had never worn before. She did not try to hide it well, because she had already made the decision, and in her mind the concealment was only a technical issue, a matter of sequencing. The filing would come first, then the settlement, then the new life she had been designing in her mind with increasing precision. The centerpiece of that design was the Meridian Arts Building. It stood on West Randolph, 8 blocks from the gallery, and Diana had wanted it for 2 years. The building had been a warehouse in a previous life, then a printing operation, and its bones were what she had always imagined a serious gallery required. High ceilings, north-facing windows on 3 floors, a ground-level exhibition space that could hold 100 people comfortably, and had the kind of quiet industrial dignity that money alone could not manufacture. The current tenant, a small architecture firm, was relocating at the end of the year. Diana had been in contact with a commercial broker named Keith, who had been tracking the building on her behalf for 18 months. The acquisition would require capital she did not currently have. But the divorce settlement, the house, the savings accounts, her share of the investment portfolio would change that calculation considerably. She had sat with Lydia Park in Lydia's offices on the 32nd floor of a downtown tower, the city visible in gray behind the windows, and had laid it out. Lydia had listened without interrupting. "Standard picture," Lydia said when Diana finished. "Consultant with no verifiable public income stream. Joint accounts, the house in Wicker Park. We file for the house, the accounts, spousal support, and the investment portfolio. His attorney will push back on the portfolio split, they always do. But given the income disparity, the court will look favorably on your position." "How long does this take?" Diana asked. 3 to 4 months if he doesn't complicate things," Lydia said, "and they rarely do when they have nothing substantial to protect." She had said it matter-of-factly, in the tone of a woman who had assessed 10,000 marital estates and could read the contours of this one in 20 minutes. Diana had nodded. She had felt, walking out of Lydia's office that afternoon, the clean relief of someone who has finally committed to a decision they have been approaching for a long time. She called Sebastian from the car. He answered on the first ring. "It's done," she said. "She's filing this week." "Good," he said. There was warmth in his voice and something else, a particular brightness that she recognized as enthusiasm for the forward motion of things. Sebastian was always most alive when something was being built or acquired. The filing arrived at their house by courier on a Thursday afternoon. Noah signed the receipt at the door without his hand shaking and carried the envelope to the kitchen table. Diana did not call. She did not come by. She had said what she needed to say through Lydia's office. 3 weekends later, she appeared at the Wicker Park house with her mother and the 2 movers. She had not warned Noah. She still had a key. He was at the kitchen table when they walked in, his laptop open, a cup of coffee beside it. He looked up. He said nothing. "We're getting this done today," Diana said, not quite looking at him, her eyes already moving over the room, with the practiced efficiency of a person who had been planning this for weeks. "Lydia has established what's mine. Don't make it complicated." Margaret stood near the doorway in her coat, arms folded, watching Noah with the expression she reserved for situations she found beneath her. "You should count yourself lucky," she said, her voice carrying the particular cold that had been decades in the making. "A man in your position ought to be grateful she isn't asking for more." Noah looked at Margaret. Something in his eyes was not what she expected, not wounded, not defensive, not angry. There was a quality to his stillness that was different from the stillness she had grown accustomed to dismissing as passivity. Then he went back to his book. The movers worked for 3 hours. They took the dining table and the 6 chairs around it. They took the artwork, 12 pieces, the best of what Diana had accumulated over 9 years of working in the industry. They took the kitchen appliances, the bedroom set, the flat time screen in the living room, the good rugs. They took the curtains from the living room windows and left the bare glass looking out at the gray October sky. Noah remained in his armchair throughout, reading. When they finally carried out the last box, the room was empty and cold and smelled like the absence of something that had been there a long time. He had kept only the leather notebook from his desk and the small wooden box that had belonged to his father. Both sat on the floor beside his chair. He waited until the sound of the truck had faded. Then he picked up his phone. 2 hours later, he was seated in a quiet corner of a restaurant near the financial district, across a small table from a man he had known for 11 years. Martin Crane was 64, silver-haired, and ran a law practice so deliberately discreet that most people in the city did not know it existed. He set a slim leather folder on the table between them. "Whenever you're ready," Martin said. Noah looked at the folder for a moment. Then he nodded. "Show me the full picture," he said. Martin Crane's office occupied a suite on the 14th floor of an older building in the financial district. The kind of building that communicated seriousness without advertisement, that had been there long enough to be trusted, and whose corridors smelled faintly of old paper and good oak. Martin had chosen it deliberately when he opened his practice, and he had never once considered moving. He opened the leather folder on the restaurant table and walked Noah through it with the measured calm of a man who had managed extraordinary things for a very long time and had made a professional decision, early in his career, never to be surprised by them. The document index ran to 54 pages. The central entity was Whitmore Capital Group, incorporated in Delaware, and the beneficial owner of Northfield Asset Partners, which held controlling interests in 7 additional operating entities and 2 fund-of-fund structures. The operating companies spanned technology infrastructure, server capacity leasing, and fiber corridor management across 3 Midwestern states, private logistics, and increasingly in recent years, clean energy, solar land development, and grid storage systems. A third holding layer, CMW Property Holdings, managed a portfolio of 41 commercial properties across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. The most recent independent valuation, conducted 7 months prior by 3 separate accounting firms, whose findings had been reconciled by a fourth, placed the total consolidated value at $43.2 billion. Diana's divorce filing had identified marital assets totaling approximately $1.6 million. The Wicker Park House 2 savings accounts, a joint investment portfolio, retirement funds. She had missed $43 billion by the width of a question she had never thought to ask. Noah had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a man named Raymond, who had worked at a car parts manufacturing plant for 31 years and who had died at 60, not quite making it to retirement, with a house that needed a new roof and 3 adult children who missed him terribly. Noah had been the youngest. He had watched his father work himself to the ground for wages that never quite covered the month, and somewhere in that grief, in the particular grief of a boy who understood too early, what a life spent trading hours for dollars looked like, at the end he had made a quiet foundational decision. The money would never be the point. The point was the work, the problem solving, the satisfaction of a system functioning exactly as designed. He had earned a full mathematics scholarship to a state university, graduated at the top of his class, worked briefly for a small investment firm on LaSalle Street, and left at 27 to start his own operation. Not a fund with its name on a tower. A series of numbered holding companies nested inside each other, managing capital for a small group of institutional clients who paid generously, asked only for consistent performance, and told no one. His name appeared nowhere public. The company directors listed on paper were employees of record, not beneficial owners. His personal lifestyle gave no indication whatsoever of the structure running quietly beneath it. By 30, his consolidated portfolio had crossed 100 million. By 35, it was approaching 2 billion. By the time Diana's movers had carried the dining table out of the Wicker Park house, the number was 43.2. She missed it entirely, Martin said. Her attorney's discovery request covered the joint bank accounts, 3 years of personal tax returns, which, as you know, reflect only your consulting income through the individual vehicle, and the property deed. They did not request corporate records. They did not file for a full marital asset declaration, because they assumed there was nothing to find, Noah said. Martin allowed himself a small, precise nod. That is one way to describe it. The counterclaim documentation was assembled from the opposite direction, not from what Diana had concealed, but from what she had not thought to hide, because she had believed the divorce would be quick and the accounting would favor her. Martin's team had reviewed 14 months of joint credit card statements and identified hotel charges, restaurant bills, and event costs amounting to $18,400, all of them cross-referenced by date and location to confirm they were incurred during the period of the affair. There was also a $9,500 transfer from the joint checking account, dated the previous March, which Diana had categorized in the account memo field as gallery consulting expenses. Martin's team had confirmed that no gallery consulting contract existed corresponding to that payment. The disclosure will need to be filed through the court, Martin said. You are legally obligated to make it, but the way it arrives, the sequence, the accompanying motions, that is something we can shape. File it completely, Noah said, for every entity, every valuation figure. I want the full picture on record. Martin nodded. He turned to the last section of the folder. There is one additional matter, he said. He set a single page on the table, facing Noah. At the top of the page, in the property schedule for CM Property Holdings, Die 341 West Randolph Street, Chicago, Illinois, commercial, mixed use, current beneficial owner, Whitmore Capital Group through CMW Property Holdings, LLC. Market value, $28.4 million. Noah read the address. He looked up at Martin. She doesn't know, Noah said. It was not a question. She does not, Martin confirmed. Her broker has been negotiating with the building's property management company, which is a third-party contractor. The ownership chain has not come up. Her acquisition is conditional on closing within 90 days. Noah sat with that for a moment. The restaurant was quiet around them. Someone set down a glass at a nearby table, and the sound was very clean in the silence. She has been trying to buy a building that belongs to me, he said. For the past 18 months, Martin said. Yes. Noah looked at the page for another moment. Then he closed the folder. File the disclosure, he said. Let's do this properly. The Meridian Arts Building had been Diana's private project for 2 years, and she had conducted it with the same careful, systematic attention she gave to everything she valued. She had walked the space 3 times with her broker Keith, measuring ceiling heights and noting the quality of the north light in each season, cataloging what would need to be replaced and what could stay. She had sketched floor plans on graph paper late at night, working out where the main exhibition wall would go, where the lighting rigs would hang, how the staircase would need to be modified for accessibility. She knew the building the way a person knows something they have decided will be theirs. She had not known who owned it, because she had not asked. She had left that to Keith, and Keith had dealt with a property management company. And Diana had trusted the chain without following it. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, she was at lunch with Sebastian and her gallery colleague Audrey at a restaurant in the West Loop. Lydia had sent a brief update that morning. The discovery requests had been filed, the process was proceeding as expected, and there was nothing on Noah's side that suggested any meaningful resistance was coming. Diana relayed this to Sebastian. He has nothing to fight with, Sebastian said, spearing a piece of duck with his fork. You knew that going in. Diana nodded. She was thinking about the Meridian Building's ground floor space, or about the kind of inaugural exhibition she would install when it was hers. Something large-scale, something that would take up the full east wall. Once the settlement clears, Sebastian continued, we should think about timeline. My project in Pilsen wraps in February. We could be looking at apartments by spring. Audrey watched this with the careful neutrality of a woman who had been Diana's closest professional friend for 7 years and had several well-considered opinions she was choosing not to share. Diana's phone was on the table. She glanced at it, nothing from Lydia. She turned it face down. The acquisition timeline required the settlement, and the settlement would come. She had planned this carefully. She did not know, as she sat there, that Martin Crane's office had sent a courier to Lydia Park's offices that morning. The package had arrived at 11:47 a.m. and had been signed for by Lydia's receptionist, who had set it on the stack for incoming materials. It sat there untouched through the lunch hours, as it was not labeled urgent, which was itself a choice Martin had made, to let it arrive quietly, like everything else associated with Noah Whitmore. At 2:14 p.m., Lydia's paralegal placed it on Lydia's desk with the afternoon deliveries. Lydia was finishing a call. She set the phone down, picked up the package, noted that it was from Martin Crane's practice, a firm she knew by reputation but had never dealt with, and opened it. The cover sheet was a single page. At the top in plain serif type, full marital asset disclosure, Whitmore Capital Group, Northfield Asset Partners, CMW Property Holdings LLC, and entities below it. Total consolidated beneficial value, $43,200,000. Lydia read the figure. She read it again. She set the page down and turned to the second page, which was a summary of the entity structure. By the third page, she had reached for her phone and placed 2 calls, one to a colleague who specialized in complex marital estate litigation, one to the managing partner of her firm's corporate practice, who had knowledge of Delaware holding company structures. Both calls were short. Both confirmed what she was reading. She sat at her desk for a while after the second call ended. Then she called Diana. Diana did not answer the first call. She was still at the restaurant, and the conversation had moved on to Sebastian's February project. and she let the call go to voicemail with the practiced ease of someone who manages a busy professional life and cannot always respond immediately. Lydia called again. Diana let that one go too. On the third call, she picked up with the slight impatience of someone being interrupted at an inconvenient moment. "I'm just finishing lunch, Lydia. Can this wait until no?" Lydia said. Her voice was flat and careful in the way of someone managing something large. "I need you in my office today, before 5. Diana looked at Sebastian across the table. He raised his eyebrows. There was something in Lydia's voice that Diana had never heard there before. She had worked with Lydia for 2 months and had never once heard her sound like this. Like a person who was keeping her composure through an act of will, rather than because she had nothing to be alarmed about. "What's happened?" Diana said. "Come to the office," Lydia said. "I'll explain when you're here." Diana ended the call. She looked at her phone for a moment, then at Sebastian. "I have to go in," she said. Sebastian signaled for the check with easy confidence. "Probably just a procedural thing," he said. "These processes always have paperwork moments." Diana nodded. She was already reaching for her coat. Something had shifted in the air around her, though she could not have said precisely what it was. Only that Lydia Park, who had never, in 2 months, sounded anything other than entirely in control, had sounded on that call like someone who was not. Lydia Park's conference room on the 32nd floor looked different when Diana walked in. That was the first thing she registered, not anything specific, but the atmosphere of the room, the way it felt compressed, as though the air had been quietly rearranged. Printed pages were spread across the conference table in a way that suggested they had been placed deliberately, organized for presentation rather than left there incidentally. Lydia was standing at the window when Diana arrived. She turned and gestured to a chair. "Sit down," Lydia said. Diana sat. "I'm going to tell you something," Lydia said, "and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond." She walked Diana through it methodically, in the way of a professional who has had to deliver very large, very bad news before and has learned that the only useful way to do it is cleanly and in sequence. The disclosure package had arrived that morning. 54 pages, verified by 4 accounting firms, incorporating an independent valuation conducted 7 months prior. The central entity was called Whitmore Capital Group, incorporated in Delaware. Through a series of subsidiary and holding structures, Whitmore Capital Group held controlling interests in 9 operating companies and a commercial property portfolio. Lydia had spent the previous 2 hours having the document reviewed by 2 external advisors. Both had confirmed that it was legitimate, complete, and legally unassailable. "The total consolidated value," Lydia said, "is $43. $2 billion. The room went very quiet. Diana looked at Lydia. Her face did not change. "That is not possible," Diana said. "It is fully documented," Lydia said, "independently verified. The structure is sophisticated but not unusual for high net worth privacy arrangements. His name is the sole beneficial owner on every entity in the chain. The valuation is current and defensible." She spread her hands on the table in the manner of someone who has nothing more to offer by way of softening. "Diana, the asset claim we filed has collapsed. We identified $6 million in marital assets. The marital estate is in reality incomprehensibly larger than anything we modeled. We need to talk about what that means." She walked her through the consequences in order. The first, the entire basis of the asset division claim had been rendered invalid. The filing would need to be revised against the actual picture of the marital estate, which would be subject to full court scrutiny. Every number they had argued, every projection they had made, was now in the wrong context entirely. The second, a counterclaim had been filed on Noah's behalf, citing financial misconduct during the marriage. Lydia placed 3 pages in front of Diana, joint credit card statements highlighted in yellow, cross-referenced by date. Hotel charges on 14 separate occasions over 7 months, totaling $18,400. A transfer of $9,500 from the joint checking account, dated the previous March, described in the memo field as gallery consulting expenses. Diana looked at the highlighted lines and said nothing. "There is no consulting contract corresponding to that payment," Lydia said. "His team has confirmed that. The documentation is thorough, every receipt is accounted for." Third consequence, the property deed. Lydia pulled out a separate page. The Wicker Park house had always been registered in Noah's name alone. Diana had never been listed on the deed. She had been a co-resident legally, but not a co-owner. Their aggressive property claim, the centerpiece of the original filing, had triggered a review clause in the original deed terms, requiring a full examination of the title. That examination was complete. The court order requiring the return of all items removed from the premises had already been submitted for approval. Diana's hands were flat on the edge of the table. "The house was never mine," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "It was never in your name," Lydia confirmed. "Legally, you did not have the right to file the property claim, and the filing of it triggered the clause." She paused. "There is a fourth item," she said. She placed the last page on the table. Diana's broker, Keith's correspondence, printed out, with a property address highlighted in the first line. 341 West Randolph Street, Chicago, Illinois. "Your acquisition target," Lydia said. "I pulled the ownership chain when I was reviewing the Whitmore disclosure. CMW Property Holdings LLC, a Whitmore Capital subsidiary, is the recorded beneficial owner of the Meridian Arts Building. The property management company you've been dealing with through Keith is a third-party contractor. The building belongs to your husband." Diana looked at the page. She did not move. Both hands were still flat on the table edge. Something had happened to the room, to the quality of the air inside it, to the particular quality of the light coming through the windows. The city was still there behind the glass, gray and ordinary and entirely indifferent. Her phone was on the table. It lit up with Sebastian's name. She did not reach for it. "He can decline the sale," Lydia said quietly. "He has every right to. The acquisition is contingent." "If the building owner does not consent, I know what contingent means," Diana said. There was a long silence. "The house," she said at last. It was not quite a question. "You're telling me that the house I stripped bare, the house I took the curtains from, was never mine to claim?" "That is correct," Lydia said. "The property has always been solely in his name. Your filing triggered the clause, and his attorneys have submitted the return order." Diana looked at her phone. Sebastian's name had gone dark, and then at the pages on the table. $43.2 billion. 9 years of marriage. A dining room table she had believed was hers being driven across the city in a rental truck. She stood. She picked up her coat. She said nothing further. She drove to her mother's house on the North Shore. She walked in through the front door, crossed the front hall, and went directly to the sitting room. She sat down on the edge of Margaret's white sofa and looked at the opposite wall. She heard her mother come to the doorway. She heard the small sound of Margaret stopping. "Diana," Margaret said. Her voice had a quality it very rarely had. "What's happened?" Diana told her, all of it, in the flat, airless way of someone delivering news they haven't yet finished processing. She did not modulate it, or soften the numbers. When she finished, Margaret sat down very slowly in the chair across from her. She removed her reading glasses. She had been wearing them, still from something she had been doing, or when Diana arrived, and set the married precision of a woman maintaining composure by a very thin thread. The clock on the mantelpiece was suddenly very loud. $43 billion, Margaret said. 43-2, Diana said. Her voice was strange and flat, like something that had been pressed until all the texture was gone. Margaret was quiet for a long time. The clock kept going, and then, in a voice that came out smaller than she intended, as if it had bypassed whatever mechanism she normally used to control the volume of her words, she said, "You let that man make coffee every morning for 9 years, Diana. And he was worth $43 billion. Neither of them said anything after that for quite some time. The court order arrived 10 days after the disclosure. All items removed from the Wicker Park premises were to be returned within 14 days. The order listed each item by category: dining furniture, kitchen appliances, artwork identified by title and estimated value, bedroom set, window treatments, electronics. At the bottom of the last page, there was a handwritten notation in the margin from the opposing attorney. The leather-bound notebook and carved wooden box, already retained by Mr. Whitmore, are not subject to this order. Diana read the order in Lydia's office. She did not say anything when she finished. The return took place on a gray Wednesday. Diana had arranged to be there, though afterward she could not have explained precisely why she felt the need to watch. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the Wicker Park house in the cold November air and watched the dining table carried back through the front door. she now knew had never legally been hers to open. She watched the kitchen appliances. She watched the artwork, 12 pieces she had selected over 9 years, pieces she had genuinely loved, pieces she had looked at every day for years and believed were hers as clearly as anything in her life had ever been hers. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt small. It was not the smallness of embarrassment exactly, though embarrassment was in it. It was the smallness of someone who has been operating with great confidence in a room they had never actually entered, and who has just understood, standing on the threshold, what the room actually contained. She drove back to her mother's house afterward and stood in the guest bathroom for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Sebastian called that evening. She did not answer. He texted later, "Hey, tried to reach you, everything okay?" She read it. She set her phone down. He called again the following morning. She did not answer that call either. What she found when she tried to form what she would say to him was that she did not know what that was. There was a version of this situation in which his involvement was the kind she had imagined, a future being built toward, a shared horizon. There was also a version of this situation in which he was a man who had told her, with considerable confidence, that Noah had nothing to fight with and who had been spectacularly wrong. She was not yet ready to determine which version she was in. On a Thursday, 2 weeks after the return order, his attorney reached out to Lydia's office separately. The counterclaim documentation had included charges from the joint account that were traceable to hotel reservations made in Sebastian's name. His counsel wanted to understand the scope of the liability exposure. The conversation was brief and not encouraging for anyone. That evening, Diana received a text. "I think it's probably best if we give each other some space for now. Things are complicated and I don't want to make your situation harder. Take care of yourself." She read it once. She set her phone face down on the counter of her mother's kitchen and did not pick it up again until the following morning. By then, Sebastian had blocked her calls. He relocated to another city 3 weeks later. Someone mentioned it to Diana eventually, at a gallery event. He was cultivating a new circle somewhere warmer. He had not left a forwarding address. The gallery acquisition, the Meridian Arts Building, the floor plans she had sketched in pencil on graph paper, the 18 months Keith had spent tracking the property on her behalf, ended with a single sentence from Keith, delivered by email. "The building owner has elected not to proceed with the sale at this time." No counteroffer was given. The broker fee she had paid Keith, the architect's preliminary assessment she had commissioned, the legal counsel she had retained for the acquisition contract, approximately $34,000 in non-refundable costs, were simply gone. The financial misconduct settlement was reached out of court, as Lydia had recommended. Diana agreed to repay the $27,900 in joint account funds used during the affair, plus applicable penalties. The total, when legal costs on all sides were included, left her personal accounts at a figure considerably lower than where they had been when all of this began. Margaret, meanwhile, moved through her social circle with the focused, systematic energy of a woman trying to get ahead of a story. She placed calls. She had lunches. She offered careful, calibrated versions of events that emphasized the complexity of the situation and the unexpectedness of what Noah had concealed. She was very good at this. She had been doing it her whole life, managing how things looked from the outside when the inside was more complicated than she wished. It did not work. The story had already arrived in every room before Margaret did. She could see it in the expressions on people's faces when she entered, the careful neutrality, the slight over-cordiality, the particular quality of a conversation that has been going on and has just shifted. People asked about Vivian with warm, thorough interest. They mentioned having heard about Noah's work, something about a foundation he was establishing. Remarkable, really, they said, more than once, that they had always sensed he was someone extraordinary. Hadn't Margaret? She said yes. She said she had always thought so. She put her wine glass down very carefully each time she said it. She began to understand, with a creeping and unwelcome clarity, that Noah's invisibility over 9 years had been entirely deliberate. He had moved through their world as a quiet, unremarkable man, and the world, she herself included, had accepted the presentation at face value. That acceptance, she began to realize, said rather more about the world's assumptions than it said about Noah. She did not share this realization with anyone. The mediation session was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Diana received the notice in Lydia's office on a Friday afternoon. She took the paper, folded it, put it in her bag, and walked out to the elevator without saying much. That night in the guest bedroom at her mother's house, she lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling. She thought about the 9 years, about the conferences and dinner parties, where she had steered the conversation away from Noah's work with such practiced ease, about the Thanksgiving table and Margaret's precise, pointed questions, about the kitchen table in the 7th year, the second glass of wine, what she had said. Had he known? All of it, all along, had he been watching the entire time, cataloging, the way she had never once thought to watch him? The question sat very still in her chest. It did not feel the way she expected it to. It felt less like anger than like something she did not have a word for yet. A recognition arriving slowly, with the particular weight of a thing that has been true for a very long time before you find out about it. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark for a long time before she slept. The mediation session was held in a conference room at Martin Crane's offices on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November. The room was neutral and clean, and smelled of fresh coffee and old wood, the kind of room that had been designed to contain large things without becoming dramatic about them. The table was long and dark and had been used for many such conversations, and it communicated nothing about any of them. Noah arrived first. He wore the same kind of quiet, well-made clothes he always wore, a dark jacket, a plain shirt, nothing that announced itself. He sat on one side of the table and waited with the stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time and has made peace with the duration of it. Martin took the chair to his right and set a folder on the table without opening it. Diana arrived 9 minutes late. She was with Lydia, who had the bearing of a woman operating in professional damage control. Composed, thorough, already thinking 2 steps ahead, Diana looked thinner than she had a month ago. The particular kind of tired that careful makeup cannot fully address had settled around her eyes. She sat across from Noah and did not look at him immediately. The legal formalities proceeded in order. Both parties were addressed. The framework of the session was established. The court's expectations were outlined. The process took 11 minutes, and at the end of it, the room held the specific quiet of a space that has been prepared for something and is now waiting for it. Diana departed from the protocol. She looked at Noah. "You knew," she said. Her voice was controlled, but underneath the control something had shifted. It was the voice of someone who has been carrying a question for 3 weeks and can no longer hold it. Noah looked at her across the table. He did not shift in his chair. He did not look away. "You want to know why I didn't tell you," he said. It was not a question. "You watched me do all of this," Diana said, "for 9 years. You watched me believe something that wasn't true, and you said nothing." She stopped. She started again, more carefully. "You let me think we had nothing." Lydia had gone very still beside her, studying the table's surface with the focused concentration of a woman who has professionally decided not to exist in this moment. Noah was quiet for a few seconds. When he spoke, his voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had not rehearsed because he had known what he would say for a long time. "In our first year," he said, "you introduced me to the Garfields at your gallery dinner on the river. You said, 'This is Noah. He does something in finance.' You turned back to them before they'd had a chance to respond. You had already decided the subject wasn't worth lingering on." He paused and let the pause have its weight. "In our 5th year, at your kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday in March, you told me that the only reason you were still in the marriage was that you couldn't afford to leave. Then you reached across the table and poured yourself a second glass of wine. You did it the way you do something you've already decided, something that doesn't require any particular thought." Another pause. The clock on the wall marked 3 seconds. "In our 7th year at Marcus Holt's retirement party in Lincoln Park, you were standing with his wife near the windows, and I was 12 feet away by the bar. You said, before she had asked you a single question, 'He's fine. He's just not ambitious in any real way.' You said it the way a person says something they believe is simply accurate, a fact about the weather." He leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance by a fraction. I did not tell you what I was worth, Noah said, because what I was worth to you had already been made entirely clear. You told me in 100 small moments across 9 years, in the tone of someone managing an embarrassment, in the things you said at other people's tables, in the thing you said at ours. The money was separate from what you valued in a person. You had demonstrated very thoroughly what you valued. His voice did not change in temperature. He was not angry. He was not wounded in any visible way. He was simply exact. You filed this divorce to take everything from a man you were certain had nothing. That was your choice, made freely and with full confidence. The consequences of that choice are what they are. He sat back. I don't wish you harm, Diana. I mean that without any irony, but I will not pretend that this outcome is unfair. It is exactly fair. Lydia had stopped pretending to look at the table. She was looking at her legal pad. The room was completely still. Diana's hands were clasped on the table in front of her. The composure she had maintained across the past 3 weeks, in Lydia's office, in her mother's sitting room, on the sidewalk watching furniture carried back through a door, had held through this as well, through the 11 minutes of formalities, and through the first part of what Noah had just said. Then it gave way, not in a collapse, not in a scene, in the slow, quiet way that things give way when they have been holding too long, and something has finally touched the place they have been protecting. Her hands clasped on the table, whitened at the knuckles. I didn't know, she said. Her voice could not quite stay steady on the last word. Noah looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face, not satisfaction, not sorrow, not the warm complexity of forgiveness. Something simpler and in some ways harder. The expression of a man who has been seen accurately at last when it is far too late to matter. No, he said quietly. You didn't, because you never tried to. That was the end of it, not the end of the legal proceedings, which would grind forward for several more weeks, but the end of anything that needed to pass between them as people who had once chosen each other. The session concluded. The parties rose. Lydia began gathering papers with the quiet efficiency of someone who wants to give her client a moment without appearing to do so. Martin caught Noah's eye at the door. The notebook, Martin said quietly, not as a question. And the wooden box, Noah said. They walked out. Diana remained at the table for a while after the room had cleared. Lydia had stepped into the hallway, giving her space, though she would have said it was to check her phone. The room was empty and quiet, and smelled of the coffee that had been brought in at the start and had now gone cold. Diana sat in the chair across from an empty chair. She looked at the space where Noah had been sitting. The clock on the wall kept going. The divorce was finalized on a gray January morning. By then, the larger drama had already concluded. What remained was the machinery of due process, which moved forward with the unhurried certainty of something that has already determined its outcome and is simply working out the paperwork. The court's final division was precise and cold. Diana received her share of the genuine joint marital assets, her portion of the joint savings accounts, her allocation of the investment portfolio that had been jointly maintained, the retirement funds that were undisputably hers. It was not nothing. Set against the filing she had made 3 months earlier, the house, the full savings, spousal support, a settlement from a man she had assumed was without resources. It was not remotely what she had reached for. Spousal support was denied without ceremony. Lydia Park submitted her final invoice. It was, as Lydia's invoices tended to be, substantial. Diana moved into a rental apartment in Lincoln Park 3 weeks after the finalization. She did not go back to her mother's guest suite, which had been suffocating in ways both of them had quietly stopped pretending it wasn't. The apartment was clean and well located and had good light in the mornings. It was not the life Diana had designed when she walked out of the Wicker Park house, with 2 hired movers in October, certain she was taking the upper hand. It was not even close to that life. She was still at the gallery. That at least had not changed. Her work was her own, and it remained, and she was good at it, and on the better mornings she could locate, in the work itself, something that felt like solid ground. She did not attempt to restart the Meridian Arts Building acquisition. Keith had moved on to other clients. The architect she had retained sent a professional follow-up email that she did not answer. Noah went back to work. He did it without announcement and without drama, returning to the same methodical process, the same numbered entities, the same spare home office that Diana had spent 9 years viewing as evidence of failure. He drove the same Volvo. He did his grocery shopping at the same store. He was, to the extent that anyone who had ever known him saw him, precisely the same person he had always been. He did, however, make one deliberate and significant change. In February, after a series of conversations with Martin that had been developing in the background for some time, longer it turned out than Diana had known him, Noah established the Whitmore Foundation. It was a private charitable organization, structured as a non-operating foundation, dedicated to educational access and vocational training for young adults from low-income backgrounds. He seeded it with $280 million from his personal portfolio. He chaired the board himself, with Martin as legal counsel and 2 educators he had met through his alma mater's development office as co-trustees. He named it after his father, Raymond. There was no press release. There was no launch event. No announcement appeared in any publication. The foundation simply began doing what it had been designed to do, identifying programs, building institutional partnerships, reviewing applications, with the same quiet, systematic efficiency that had characterized everything Noah had ever built. The first cohort of scholarship recipients, 38 young adults from 9 states, in programs ranging from engineering technology to culinary arts to healthcare logistics, began their studies the following September. Noah attended the orientation event at a partner university on a Friday morning. He drove there in the Volvo. He stood at the back of the room and watched them file in 38 people, who had been given a door that might otherwise have stayed closed, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for a very long time. Margaret Caldwell spent the early months of that year doing what people of a certain social standing always do. When something shattering has occurred, she controlled the narrative. She told people the divorce had been mutual. She told people Diana was thriving, finding herself, making positive changes. She deployed these phrases with the practiced precision of someone who had been managing public perception for 6 decades. It did not work. The story had a quality that resisted management, not because it was salacious exactly, but because it was specific and accurate, and had been confirmed by too many people who worked in finance and legal circles to be softened by polite retellings. It arrived in every room before Margaret did. The expressions on people's faces when Noah's name came up, politely interested, carefully warm, told her everything she needed to know about how much they had already heard, and how little any version she offered was going to change that. Several people mentioned, with what appeared to be genuine admiration, that they had read about Noah's foundation. Remarkable work. A man like that, apparently. They had always sensed something about him, hadn't they? Margaret said each time that yes, she had always thought he was extraordinary. She said it fewer and fewer times as the months went on, because the sentence had a way of landing that she found, eventually, difficult to continue engineering. She said it to herself, once, in the car on the way home from one of those dinners. She sat with that for the rest of the drive. In the late spring of the following year, Noah attended a reception hosted by one of the Whitmore Foundation's partner organizations, a workforce development nonprofit based in Pilsen. It was held in a renovated warehouse space that still smelled faintly of the printing operation it had replaced, and the crowd was a mix of educators, researchers, and professionals who had given time or funding to the organization's programs. He met Rachel at the edge of the room, near a window that looked out onto the street below. She was a structural engineer who had grown up in modest circumstances in rural Wisconsin and who had driven herself, by a combination of talent and tenacity, into a career that required both. She asked Noah a question about the Foundation's workforce programs that required him to think before he answered. He noticed that not many people asked questions that required actual thinking. They talked for 40 minutes without finding a reason to stop. She knew he was on the board of the Foundation. She knew he drove an old car. She knew from a comment he made in passing that he apparently felt strongly about a worn leather notebook he carried with him to every meeting. He mentioned it with the self-aware, rueful quality of someone who has been teased about a habit enough times to have developed a sense of humor about it. On their third meeting, she asked what he did for work. He told her. Not everything, not all at once, not the full architecture of entities and valuations, and the particular history of how all of it had been built in the years when he was invisible and no one was looking. But honestly, and in enough of a way to be clear, without deflection, with the directness of a man who had spent a long time keeping a secret and had understood slowly that the keeping had cost him something real. She listened to all of it without her expression changing very much. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like it takes a great deal of patience." "It does," Noah said. "Good," Rachel said. She smiled in the way that some people have, not with performance, not with calculation, but with genuine, uncomplicated warmth directed at the person in front of her rather than the thing he represented. "I find I like patient people." He drove home in the Volvo that night, with the leather notebook on the passenger seat, and something in his chest that had not been there for a long time. Not excitement exactly, something quieter than that. Something that felt for the first time in years like a direction worth moving toward. Diana encountered Noah's name formally one more time, in the autumn of that same year. She was standing in the kitchen of her Lincoln Park apartment on a weekday morning, coffee in hand, scrolling through a financial news application before work. A brief item, 3 paragraphs. Noted that Whitmore Capital Group had completed a major infrastructure acquisition in the clean energy sector, pushing the company's total consolidated value past $50 billion. The article mentioned the beneficial owner by name in the final line. She read his name. She read the number beside it. She stood there for a moment with her coffee. Then she set her phone face down on the counter. She stood in the morning quiet of her kitchen, the city outside just starting its noise, the light coming in the way it always did at this hour, clean and a little cold and perfectly indifferent. She thought about the 9 years, about the kitchen table in their 7th year and what she had said, about the dinner parties and the introductions, about the Thanksgiving table at her mother's house and the way Noah had looked at Margaret's precise, pointed questions and simply answered them, without defense, without bitterness, with the patience of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment. She had thought, for 9 years, that his patience was emptiness. She understood now that she had it entirely reversed. She stood in the kitchen for another minute or two. The coffee had gone cold in her hand. Then she poured it down the drain, rinsed the cup, and went to get ready for the day. There is a particular and very specific cruelty in being certain you know the value of something, and being completely wrong, not about the numbers, about the person. It is the cruelty of the person who walks into a quiet room, glances at what is in it, decides nothing there is worth their time and leaves, only to hear years later what was actually in that room and what it would have meant to have stayed. The room did not change. The person's understanding of it did, and the room was never diminished by the wrong assessment. Only the assessor was, in the end. Diana Whitmore had been wrong about everything, not just about what was in a bank account, but about what she had actually had within reach for 9 years, and what she had chosen to do with it, day after ordinary day, until there was nothing left to choose. That realization, unlike a settlement figure, does not resolve itself. It simply remains. What would you have done differently as Diana or as Noah? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, that like button is right there. I'll see you in the next one.